Thank you and welcome everyone. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. This is Hal Stern. I'm one of the co-directors of CSAFE, the Center for Statistics and Applications in Forensic Evidence. I'm going to take a couple of minutes to do a brief introduction to what CSAFE is and some dates for the future, and then turn it over to today's webinar speaker, Simon Cole. Many of you probably know about CSAFE, but a few probably do not. CSAFE is a collaborative center of excellence, and we work in cooperation with NIST, the U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technology, to strengthen the validity of the analysis and interpretation of forensic evidence. We are a team of 60 researchers. There are 4 kind of core universities that form the backbone of the Center of Excellence, though we collaborate across a number of other universities as well. We have research projects. We do education and training as well. Webinars like this. We also go out and do workshops and other types of training activities. In terms of future announcements for future events, the webinars are typically monthly. I think there's only the second of the fall, but typically monthly. And the next 2 are listed on this slide. One on crime scene reconstruction by Dr. Keith Inman, and one on the first of a series of 2 webinars on weight and strength of evidence by Professor Danica Oman of Iowa State. Also on this slide, there's a reminder about the upcoming AAFS meeting in Baltimore. And for all the CSAFE folks who are listening and the members of our advisory boards, I also wanted to put out there a notification that the all-hands meeting will run May 20 to 22. It's a Monday through Wednesday at Iowa State, a little bit longer than usual because part of the meeting will also address the possible renewal of the center when it expires in 2020. So that's the basic introduction. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Harley, who sent out the Connect information for CSAFE, or myself. And with that introduction, let me share Simon's slides. Great. So Simon Cole, professor of criminology at UC Irvine, one of the 4 institutions. Simon is a sociologist, studies sociology and historian of science, with a focus on exactly where CSAFE lives, the intersection of science and technology with law and criminal justice. And he's been exploring the use of probabilistic language in that process. And I'll turn it over to Simon.
Okay. Thanks, Hal. And I want to thank Hal also for showing up so that I don't feel like I'm talking to an empty room, which is kind of awkward. So you can hear me okay? Oh, they can't speak back. Okay. This project is called Analysis of Forensic Testimony and Reports, done with my students, Matt Arno and Valerie King. So the main goal of CSAFE is to build a statistically sound foundation for the analysis of forensic evidence. And we spend a lot of time talking about how forensic evidence should be reported statistically, how it might be interpreted by lay people and so on. But we don't spend that much time thinking about how it is reported now. And so the initial purpose of this project was to kind of try to develop a baseline as to how evidence is reported now, not in sort of anecdotal cases that people hear about and make notorious, but in run-of-the-mill cases in courtrooms, and even not in courtrooms, since many cases are resolved without trials and plea bargains where the evidence might be based on a laboratory report and so on. And I should say, as my disclaimer at the outset, that this is a work in progress, and so it's not entirely finished. So in some sense, the questions, my initial questions were, are reports consistent with disciplinary standards? And to what extent forensic reports are now, or in the recent past, probabilistic in nature, so that we have a sense of how far we have to go in getting reports to be probabilistic, perhaps at some point how much we've achieved in moving reports towards a probabilistic framework. And if they are reported probabilistically, how is that expressed? So recommendation number 2 of the famous 2009 National Research Council report, Strengthening Forensic Science in the United States, was about precisely this, was about standardizing the language used in reporting forensic testimony. And the 2009 report, I think, correctly observed that there was very little standardization in the reporting of forensic testimony. Different people and laboratories were using the same terms to mean different things. And forensic experts were sort of using the terms that came naturally to them rather than something imposed upon them by some kind of standardized framework. In some sense, this raises the question of what the NRC or we really mean when we say that forensic reports should be standardized. Does that just mean that we should have written standards, or does that mean that we actually want to prescribe the words that experts use, for example, in their testimony or in their laboratory reports? If the latter, one reason for that is that if we don't standardize language, experts are not going to be able to convey the weight of the evidence in a carefully calibrated fashion. And it's difficult enough to do this in the first place. If you think of how hard it is to not to commit the prosecutor's fallacy when you're speaking and things like that. If we don't prescribe language, people are going to get things wrong, and then they'll be heard wrong by the consumer of the evidence. On the other hand, it sounds, and I'll give some examples of that in a second. On the other hand, it seems a little bit rigid to take somebody who's testifying as an expert witness or as a scientist or reporting as an expert witness as a scientist and say, this is the language that you must use. It seems to sort of de-skill their authority as a scientist. And it seems in some ways sort of unfaithful to the idea of conveying the weight of the evidence as the expert perceives it. The approach that I've taken is loosely based on a study that I did in 2007 of fingerprint evidence, where I was interested to know what words fingerprint examiners actually use in court, which was based on transcripts. And one of the interesting findings there was that they did not use the words that their standard, the closest thing to their standard, which was the Swig-Fast standard, told them to use, which was individualization. They used sort of vernacular expressions meant to convey the same idea. These things are the same. I identified this to this. The two things are identical. Sort of semantic, folksy workarounds to the same thing, but not precisely the words that they were told to do. Another kind of testimony review is the well-known FBI NACDL hair comparison review of 2015 that's gotten a lot of attention, and in which they reviewed 269 transcripts in the first pass. I believe they're reviewing more, and found what they called erroneous testimony in 258 of them. So testimony that went beyond what they called the limits of science. That review led to some discussion within the Justice Department of we should do reviews like this for all the other disciplines. And the Justice Department continues to say that it is planning to do this kind of review. So in doing a project like this, we have data issues, like many things in CSAFE. We hear a lot about them. We have them in social science as well. So, you know, what we would like is a record of every laboratory report and every trial transcript for each discipline in every case. And so we can see what experts are actually saying. Another way of approaching it would be to maybe have the laboratory protocols or standard operating procedures for every laboratory. If we can see what laboratories are actually instructing their experts to say in court, we could at least know that, although we might not know if they are actually using those words. Unfortunately, it's pretty difficult to get that data. So those of you who don't work in law may not know that trial transcripts are not systematically archived, indexed, or even made publicly available. Sometimes the litigants have them in a case, although often they don't. Often that's the appellate litigant who might have it. And many forensic experts and laboratories don't have the transcripts of their own testimony. They wouldn't, as a matter of course, have that. Laboratory reports are even less well archived or indexed or made publicly available. Some litigants may possess them. Of course, an expert or laboratory probably has their own reports, but there's no mandate to archive them, index them, or make them publicly available. So we do have powerful legal databases called Westlaw and Lexis, but those are very useful, full-text searchable databases of appellate opinions. And appellate opinions are not trials, they're not trial transcripts, and not every trial results in an appellate opinion. Trials result in appellate opinions in a haphazard and non-representative way. So they're a very awkward way of getting at transcripts. Sometimes an appellate opinion might tell you what the expert said verbatim, and other times they might not. Westlaw, however, does have a very kind of strange one-off database of forensic transcripts and reports, categorized by discipline. So we were able to exploit those for a number of the more commonly used disciplines: latent prints, firearms and tool marks, and question documents. We were also able to get some transcripts and reports from people who consult on cases involving latent prints and firearms and tool marks. And that pretty much got us stuck with those three disciplines. We then got a very useful suggestion to look at the CTS tests. Those are the collaborative testing services proficiency tests. And the Shoeprint test at least asks a question, which is, what report would you write about this item? So it's not a real case, but it is a simulated case, and it is actually exactly the question we want, which is how would you write the report? There are also CTS tests for blood pattern, but we were able to make I have a 0 here because we're basically able to make no progress with blood pattern, partly because blood pattern testimony doesn't fit into the kind of pattern recognition framework of the other CSAFE in scope disciplines, in terms of saying whether two things are from the same source. Blood pattern evidence is more about the cause of a particular kind of pattern. So we haven't quite figured out how to map that in a way consistent with the other disciplines. So these are not good samples. They're opportunistic. They're non-random. One thing I don't worry about is that they're kind of skewed towards bad evidence. I think if anything, they're skewed towards good evidence because they're people in cases that got some attention from appellate courts or from consultants. They're people who participate in CTS tests, and so on. So a couple presumptions about probabilistic evidence that kind of underlie what I'm going to say, and I hope are sort of non-controversial. to this audience, we sort of began with the assumptions that all evidence is probabilistic in nature and that it should therefore be reported in a probabilistic fashion, by which we mean that some probability, no matter how small, should be assigned to each hypothesis. And that's what we mean by probabilistic reporting. That categorical reporting is at least suboptimal, if not worse, and that it's something that the disciplines would like to get beyond if they can. That data is better than no data, but that absent data, there may be other approaches, such as the use of subjective probabilities, that might be preferable to the alternatives. So here I just want to describe a process that's going to, I hope, orient you to the slides I'm about to show you. So what we begin with is a standard. So we try to find a standard, like a swig-fast standard or an OSAC standard, although we don't have any yet for our study. Some kind of standard from the discipline saying how experts should testify. We then have a data source, which you saw on a previous slide. And we then have a bunch of reports that are either transcripts or laboratory reports where some expert gave a report about some evidence. We then try to interpret which report on the standard the expert's report corresponds to, right? So we're assuming that you can only report within the standard. What is this report trying to say, even if it doesn't actually use the words that the standard uses? Then we try to look at the language that's actually used. So do they use the words that the standard says to use, or do they use other words? That allows us to sort of measure adherence to the standard. Are you using the words or phrases that the standard tells you? We're then asking a different question, which is this probabilistic or not? And again, our definition is merely that probabilities of 1 and 0 are not probabilistic. All other probabilities are. And then we have the type of probabilistic reporting. And for this, this will be difficult to read, but this is something we took from Cedric Neumann and Madeline Ozdemir. And they took it from Colin Aiken and co-authors from their pamphlet from the Royal Statistical Society of a couple of years ago, the Guide to Communicating and Interpreting Statistical Evidence. And again, this is difficult to read, but the useful thing about it is it just kind of lays out a number of ways in which evidence should be reported, from categorical conclusions, which is, again, what we're trying to move away from, and then a number of probabilistic reports, which are sort of divided into subjective versus objective and verbal versus numerical. Then we have a category called evidence, and they lay out a number of different quantitative ways of reporting evidence, likelihood ratios and random match probabilities. It's okay if you can't read this because these aren't going to come up in our study because nobody uses them. But they are there, and we did consider them. The most problematic category is this one, which is consistent with /match. And so the word match is odd and, as most of you know, notoriously vague. And the problem with the word match is that it can mean anything from consistent with to some kind of categorical conclusion that the two things came from the same source, and that the word is ambiguous in that sense. So to me, it's a little odd to put match in with consistent with, because most of the time I see the word match, it really is trying to mean something like a categorical conclusion that the two things do come from the same source, not that they might come from the same source, and I have no idea what that probability is. Nonetheless, to be faithful to this framework, if experts use the word match, we coded it as consistent with, but I think that may be overly generous to those experts. Here are the standards we used. We have SWIG-FAST standards for latent prints, AFT range of conclusions for firearm tool marks, SWIG-DOC for question documents, and SWIG-TRED for Shoeprints. You'll notice these are all SWIG documents that may or may not become OSAC documents sometime soon. And for those of you who don't know that much about the process, the reason for the old dates is that we're in the process of writing new standards, and most of the SWIGs have stopped work and are sort of transitioning to OSAC standards. So here's a very busy slide, but it follows the process that I showed before for Shoeprints. This is the scale that exists on the standard from exclusion up through identification, although we don't have any identifications reported. This is the number of each report, again, as coded by us, whether they used the word in the standard or not. And here we have the actual language used. So Shoeprints is particularly egregious in that we get sort of five different categories of words used for this single report, high degree of association, that these words are different enough that we thought they merited their own sort of categories. So almost all the testimony is probabilistic because we don't have any identifications and very few exclusions. And Shoeprint tends to fall into two categories, which we're calling consistent with or subjective verbal probability, that they are either just describing the consistencies and leaving it there, not drawing any inference from it, or they are drawing some kind of subjective verbal inference, like the shoe could have made the mark. I also highlighted here in crosshatches that we do seem to have some Bayesian respondents to the Shoeprint CTS tests who insisted on using what's clearly a Bayesian framework for their report, and talked about extremely or very strong support for the proposition. So there was no use of identification. The testimony was almost always probabilistic. We saw a lot of the associations are clustered in high rather than in the lower categories, but I don't think we can infer that much to it from that, because remember, these are CTS tests, so the test maker has control over the nature of the samples that were put in. So maybe they were all high degree of association. But one thing that's particularly important to notice is the use of the same term in the actual report to indicate different conclusions according to the standard, right? So we see similar use to mean 3 different reports. And those were pretty clearly different things. If you read the actual test report, in some cases, similar really means, oh, it's a very limited association. I wouldn't want to conclude much from this. And in others, it means this is a very high degree of association. I think it's very likely they come from the same source. You also see that with the consistent and correspondence language, where you, again, get them used for a wide range of reports, from limited association to high degree of association. We have relatively low adherence to the standard. And again, we have a kind of 50-50 split between whether people like to report consistencies or posterior probabilities. And we have this kind of interesting vocal minority of Bayesian responses, contrary to the SWIG standard, but only for the high association conclusion. Fingerprints is a little simpler. And one reason for that might be that the standard is a 3-part standard rather than a 5 or 7 part standard. Some of you have seen this data before, but we have relatively high adherence to the standard. Almost no evidence is probabilistic. It's almost all categorical. And if we coded the term match as categorical, it would be virtually all categorical. So high adherence to standard, but again, fingerprint examiners in practice use at least 3 clear formulations: individualized or identified, same source or person, match, and possession. It's his print, which is kind of an odd formulation, but again, I think the consumer of the evidence probably knows what that means. And it's almost all categorical, almost none probabilistic. Firearms and tool marks is also a 3-part scheme with basically perfect adherence to the standard. Very little probabilistic testimony. We coded every inconclusive report as inherently probabilistic. A lot of categorical testimony. A little bit of subjective posterior verbal reports, and the only one in the whole data set, one subjective posterior numerical report. So you probably want to know about that numerical report. That's down here. I was not able to assign it 100% certainty, but what we call a quote, entirely consistent 95% certainty. So we coded that as numerical because it's a number. We code it as subjective because we're not aware of any data that underlies or allowed the expert to arrive at that number. Probability is discussed pretty much in all of these transcripts only in its denial. And I didn't include those quotations here. I've shown them at previous CSAFE meetings in which the examiners sort of explain, oh no, we don't use probabilities in firearm or tool mark analysis. Question documents is again a wide range of possible conclusions. About 50% adherence to the standard words, and about 50% use of other words like may have, or same source, or could not determine. About 50% probabilistic, that's basically these categories in the middle, and 50% categorical, that's the individualizations and eliminations. And again, as with Shoeprints, we see the kind of use of the same folksy vernacular terms like may have to mean very different things. In one case, may have was used to indicate a report which I coded as indications, meaning they thought it was weak evidence that the two samples were from the same source. And may have was also used in another case in which the expert said, all I'm saying is I wasn't able to eliminate it, which I code as this. I don't know if that's what the expert meant, but they did say, all I can say is that I wasn't able to eliminate it. To me, that sounds like this possibly strong probability did not. It's not clear. So if you compile all of these into a single table, you can kind of compare the adherence to standards from 100% in tool marks to 42% in Shoeprints. You can see that that Shoeprints are highly probabilistic, friction ridge not at all, and firearm and tool mark very little. Question document about 50-50. You can see high rates of categorical reporting. And you can see that all we have are reports of consistency, subjective, verbal, posterior probabilities, and categorical reports. If we discount that one numerical report that I showed you. So if you think back to all the kinds of reports that Aiken and Neumann and Ozdemir said one could have, we really only have 3 types in these in-scope disciplines. So one thing that's clear is that the kind of 3 category disciplines have higher adherence to standards than the 5 to 7 category disciplines, which is kind of makes sense. It's not surprising, but their probabilistic testimony is lower because they have these sort of categorical conclusions at the extremes of the categories. We see very high usage of categorical testimony and probably equally undesirable testimony of just mere consistency. We see very little probabilistic testimony, and the testimony that we see is overwhelmingly verbal rather than quantified, and overwhelmingly subjective rather than objective. And there's almost no numerical probabilities, and if there are, we don't quite know what the data source behind them is. So one problem with the method that I just showed you is the timeliness with this way of gathering data, at least for the first 3 disciplines: question documents, firearms and tool marks, and fingerprints. We're looking in these Westlaw databases and consultants files. And it's not always all that recent. So one question is whether the field has changed, and we're using old information to characterize the present. So one way we tried to approach this was to simply survey laboratories about how do you tell your experts to testify now. So this is the SOP kind of approach. Let's ask them how they instruct their examiners to testify. And AskLad was very cooperative in being willing to distribute a survey on this. And the survey was sort of framed as, why don't you show us your SOP? Show us some kind of document that tells us how you instruct your examiners to testify in these disciplines. If you can't or won't do that, just tell us how you instruct them to testify. AskLad, that appeared in the AskLad newsletter 9 times. There were some problems with the initial things with the link working, unfortunately, but eventually it did work. We decided to also ask the European Network of Forensic Science Institutes to distribute it. And they distributed it by email at least twice. The results were pretty disappointing. We got 7 open surveys, 28 sort of legitimate responses where they said they were eligible and willing to participate, and only 8 laboratories that answered these detailed questions about how their reporting practices in the specific CSAFE in-scope disciplines. A few more skip that part and were willing to answer the opinion questions about probabilistic reporting. So here's the descriptive statistics of the 8 that answered the detailed questions. And the interesting thing is that they all came through EMSI, not through AskLad. We got no American responses. Couple law enforcement agencies, a couple other government agencies, and a couple academies of science. Laboratory sizes ranging from 30 to 500. So with these 8, we are able to say a couple of things. These are the numbers that say they practice each of the in-scope disciplines. So they all practice handwriting, and then smaller numbers, the other disciplines. These are the numbers that consider their own reporting probabilistic for this discipline. These are the numbers that report that, yes, it is probabilistic, but it's a verbal report. So almost all of them. And then we ask, if you're using a verbal scale, as most of them are, what's the range? And again, we get this 3, 5, 7 kind of range that we saw before. Is there some kind of quantitative basis for the verbal report? One lab is saying yes. It's the same lab for all of these disciplines. One lab is answering yes to that. One lab is answering yes, we give a numerical report. And that report looks to be, again, a lot like that toolmark report I showed. 95%, I'm 95% certain. Again, with it being unclear where that number 95 comes from. This survey doesn't tell us anything about American laboratories, but it tells us a little bit about European laboratories. Some of them think they're testifying probabilistically. Not all of them characterize themselves as testifying probabilistically, although perhaps by my definition they are. The probabilities are overwhelmingly verbal. There are almost no numerical probabilities, and it's not clear if there's a databases for those numerical probabilities, but there is one laboratory that that is arguing it has a numerical basis for its verbal probabilities. As I mentioned, we asked some opinion questions. We got more responses to those. Again, all European, little bit different range of institutions. All of those 8 are included in the 14 here. Just some basic opinions. The respondents think that probabilistic reporting is necessary generally. They think it's important. Nobody's saying it's not important. Nobody's saying it's not necessary. They think modest progress has been taken towards achieving probabilistic reporting. How much probabilistic reporting goes on? We got a wide range, 10 to 100%. How many reports are probabilistic? 5 to 100%. So a wide range of interpretations of answers to this question. Another way of trying to get at this question might be publicly available standard operating procedures. I've worked in this field a long time. It's not clear to me why every public laboratory's standard operating procedure for every discipline is not publicly available on the internet. I don't see what about this should not be a public document. And some states do have them published. The State Laboratory of Georgia and of Virginia have their SOPs online. The Department of Justice a couple of years ago promised to do so, and they do now. They now have begun compiling on their website the publication of documents from federal laboratories. This has appeared in the last few months or so. So we haven't gone through these or coded these yet. I would note, however, that the FBI documents, for example, they are there. They're there for many of the in-scope disciplines, but they have quality manuals and SOPs, but they do not have documents that describe how their examiners are supposed to report. So that whatever document covers the reporting question is not there yet for the FBI in these disciplines. This is a slide out of order from the opinion survey. What can we say from all this? Perhaps not that much. Data is difficult to get. Most SOPs are still not publicly available, and that's something that would be nice to have if we want to make forensic science transparent. It does seem to me that protocols and SOPs, I'm not sure I see a reason why they shouldn't be publicly available. There was not much American interest in completing my survey. There's never an obvious way to interpret non-response to a survey, so I can't infer much from that, but there's little probabilistic reporting, especially in the disciplines with the identification individualization conclusion available to them and commonly used, and the three category schemes, which I'll say more about in a second, particularly latent prints and firearms and tool marks. And what probabilities there are overwhelmingly subjective and verbal, little or no quantitative basis for verbal probability. So if we're trying to establish a baseline for what CSAFE is trying to build on, any progress would be progress in some sense. In closing, I just want to mention one thing that's interesting about these verbal scales, because I'm aware that OSAC is now working on a document moving from kind of a 3-category verbal scale to a 5-category verbal scale in all disciplines, and this data kind of speaks to some of the trade-offs you might get in that, right? We saw that the 3-category disciplines have high adherence to standards and high use of categorical non-probabilistic reports. The 5-category disciplines have lower adherence to standards, which might raise some questions for a standard-setting body, but they have more probabilistic testimony, even though it's neither objective nor quantitative. So we can anticipate that moving to a 5-category categorical framework may require greater attention to the actual language used on the ground in courtrooms and in reports, because we see in the status quo the temptation to translate the standard into one's own personal vernacular way of explaining it to, say, a layperson. I think that's probably less strong in a written report and more strong in a courtroom sitting in front of an audience of lay people, and thinking that high degree of association is too technical and wanting to translate that into something more that sounds more like vernacular English. But we see that if that happens, then you can get away with the intended meaning of the standard. So I'm just raising that as something to think about, whether this 5-category scheme is going to need to be accompanied by a sort of greater push to, yes, what we mean by the standard is we actually want you to use this prescribed language that we are giving to you. So here's some thank yous, and I'm happy to take questions, however that works.
There's a number of questions in the chat.
I was trying to get it set up so that I could see the chat on my screen, but I couldn't. So now let's open up this chat. Okay. Okay. So here.
Yeah. So I'll start with that one.
Yeah.
Do you want me to read the question, or?
Sure.
All right. So I'm addressing this this question from Mesa Forensic Science Service. There are identifications in the CTS footwear examinations. That's right. So so those are missing in the data that we reported, and I noticed that relatively recently. So we need to take a look at those. So, but that's absolutely right. It's not true that there are no identifications reported in this CTS data. That's a comment, yeah. I think.
That's an interesting one to comment on.
From Deborah Smith, to the layperson, most of these statements in the 5+ conclusion disciplines seem too similar to differentiate, or so I have been told. Okay.
Well, it's an interesting part of the move to having more conclusions is whether and there's been some data.
Oh, meaning the 5 conclusions in the framework.
Yeah.
High degree of association, and limited
and
association.
How well people can,
that lay people can't even distinguish those.
And what the experts are doing in these disciplines. That's a long one from Steve Brock that talks about ways you might get more data.
Okay.
And then there's a question from Marty Herman.
For footwear, where the conclusion indicates the degree of association of features between a crime scene impression and a shoe, is that conclusion really just a match score as opposed to a probabilistic conclusion? I don't know. Yeah. Jeff wrote me earlier. Yes, Jeff, I got your email and I'm planning to respond. Right. And may apply to categories like presumptive and confirmatory in drugs. I have not thought about investigating these other out-of-scope disciplines, but we could. The number 95% is different than the words 95%. Interesting point. Yeah.
So I have a question, Simon, which is when you do an exercise like this in terms of kind of coding of transcripts into categories, sometimes you ask the question about whether someone else would make the same decisions and the same calls where people use non-standard language. If they're adhering to the standard, it's pretty straightforward if they use the exact language that the standard prescribes. But where you have to maybe make a judgment about did they mean strong association or similar or something like that. So I don't know, did you consider that at all? Have more than one person go over a transcript?
In terms of our coding, our coding decisions, yes. So we had a number of it was sort of an iterative process of coding in which we had hard cases and looked at them and talked about it, and then redid our coding scheme, and then came back and recoded the data again. We did not have a blind 2-person inter-rater kind of coding scheme. Instead, we had a less desirable, but I think necessary, kind of hierarchical coding in which the student coded it, and then I looked at it, and then my decisions trumped. But I think that was necessary in this case.
Okay, I don't see any other. Oh, here you go.
So question from Alex Biederman about the alters. Yeah, you're right. I didn't think I didn't think of treating the alters as the reporting instructions, but I suppose in some sense they are. So that's an interesting idea to incorporate them as part of as essentially the reporting instructions for the federal laboratories. For the FBI, I know that they have documents with reporting instructions, so they would have both that and the alter. But yeah, that would be an interesting approach. By probabilistic conclusion, do you mean simply any statements that are more than a 3-point scale? Well, our definition of probabilistic conclusion is a value between 1 and 0, or any kind of conclusion that doesn't eliminate the alternative hypothesis, right? So that allows that the alternative hypothesis might be true. So examples of non-probabilistic conclusions are these two things came from the same source, and the words individualization and identification, which essentially are defined to mean that. So then Marty asks, do you mean inconclusive exclusion and ident? What I mean is that ident and exclusion are non-probabilistic conclusions, and if you mean inconclusive, that is inherently a probabilistic conclusion. Cami asks, are you not including a likelihood ratio? I would classify, I would code a likelihood ratio as a probabilistic conclusion. As long as there's not infinity on one side of the likelihood ratio, right?
But there were no instances.
Right, but that's one thing to notice, right? No likelihood ratios, no random match probabilities, no compound probabilities of inclusion, none of these things that that we talk about for DNA analysis, for example.
Okay, so I think that's all the questions we've received. So I want to thank everybody for connecting up and participating in the webinar, and thank Simon very much for the presentation. Any other thoughts, of course, you're welcome to email in, and if not, we'll close down the webinar. The next webinar will be in December. Thank you very much. One thing, we'll stop sharing. How's that? Yeah.